The dust smells of chickens and fear. It cakes the back of Alara's throat, a gritty paste she can't swallow past the lump of terror lodged there. From a crack between the rough-hewn planks of the henhouse wall, she watches the boots. They are heavy, worn, scuffed at the toe, moving with a weary deliberation that is somehow more frightening than haste. They are coming closer. The hens, initially startled by her desperate intrusion, have settled into a low, rumbling cacophony of clucks and rustles, a sound that feels as loud as a gunshot in the tense quiet of the late afternoon. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the soft, insistent life stirring within her. She presses a hand to her swollen belly, a protective, reflexive gesture. "Be still," she pleads silently, not knowing if she's talking to the babe or her own rattling nerves. The boots stop directly outside the flimsy door. A shadow falls across the sliver of light, plunging her into near-total darkness. There's a long, drawn-out silence, broken only by the shifting of the chickens and the ragged whisper of her own breathing. She imagines a rifle barrel nosing through the door, the cold, final click of a hammer. The latch scrapes, a sound of pure doom. The door swings inward, flooding the small space with blinding, golden light. A silhouette stands there, tall and broad, blocking out the sun. Alara flinches back, pressing herself into the corner, into the filth and the feathers, try to make herself smaller, invisible. Her fugitive's prayer. The man says nothing. He simply stands there, letting his eyes adjust. She can see him more clearly now. He is a black man, his face carved with lines of exhaustion and sun. He wears the simple, durable clothes of a rancher, not a lawman, not a bounty hunter. But that means nothing. Men hunting fugitives often wore disguises. He takes in the scene, the terrified, disheveled woman, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, the slight but undeniable swell of her stomach beneath the tattered dress. His gaze is not cruel, not angry. It is something far more unnerving, quiet, assessing, and profoundly tired. He looks from her to the empty water pail by the door, then back to her chapped lips. He turns without a word and walks away. Alara's breath catches. Is he leaving? Going for a gun? For a rope? But he returns a moment later, holding a tin dipper brimming with cool, clear water. He crouches, his knees popping softly, and extends it to her. His movements are slow, deliberate, meant not to startle a wild thing. "You look like you could use this," he says. His voice is a low baritone, rough like gravel, but with no sharp edges. It isn't the voice of a monster. Alara stares at the dipper, then at his face. She sees no trickery in his eyes, only a deep, abiding weariness that seems to mirror her own. For a week, she has been hunted, scorned, seen only as a criminal or a reward. This man, this stranger whose sanctuary she has violated, is the first person to see her as a woman who is thirsty. With a trembling hand, she reaches out and takes the dipper. He doesn't let go until he is sure she has a firm grip, and in that brief, shared touch, his calloused fingers against her trembling ones, a silent contract is offered. It isn't a promise of safety, not yet. It is something much simpler and more profound, a moment of grace. And as she brings the water to her lips, the taste of it clean and cold and real, she knows that this small, quiet act of kindness has just altered the course of her entire life. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The man's name was Silas. He owned the modest ranch, the dusty yard, the wary chickens, and the silence that surrounded it all. He had bought the land 3 years prior, 160 acres of hard-packed earth and stubborn grama grass that the territory was practically giving away to anyone willing to break their back on it. To the people in the nearby town of Redemption, a name dripping with an irony they were blind to, Silas was an anomaly, a curiosity they watched with narrowed, suspicious eyes. A black man owning his own spread, keeping to himself, answering questions with a quiet nod or a single, clipped word. They didn't know what to make of him, so they mostly made up stories. He was a runaway, they whispered, a former outlaw laying low. He'd found gold. He'd killed a man for the deed to the place. The truth was far simpler and, in its own way, more complex. Silas had worn a uniform once, the blue of the Union Army, and had fought in battles men would later write about in hushed, reverent tones. He had seen the worst of what men could do to one another and had come away from it with a deep craving for solitude. After the war, he drifted, taking work where he could find it, breaking horses, trailing cattle, his skin color a constant barrier he had to either crash through or silently endure. Eventually, he'd save enough to buy this piece of land, this quiet corner of the world where his only company was the wind and the memories he tried to keep buried. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from the noise of the world, from the constant, grinding judgment of other people. He had come here seeking peace, and for 3 years, he had found a fragile version of it. Until today, until the woman in his henhouse. He had watched her drink, her throat working convulsively, her eyes squeezed shut as if in prayer. When the dipper was empty, she held it out to him, her gaze skittish, like a doe ready to bolt at the slightest sound. He took it and refilled it from the bucket. She drank the second, one more slowly. He saw the tremor in her hands, the hollows under her eyes, the way her dress, once fine, was now torn and stained. And he saw her belly. He was a man who noticed things. It was a skill honed by survival, by a life of having to read a room, or a trail, or a man's intentions in a single glance. He knew desperation when he saw it, and this woman was drowning in it. He could have turned her away. He should have. A lone woman appearing on his property was trouble of a kind he had deliberately structured his life to avoid. She could be a thief, a lure for a gang of bandits, or simply mad. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to point her toward the road to redemption and let the sheriff sort it out. But he looked at her, huddled in the filth, her hand resting protectively on her unborn child, and he saw not a threat, but a reflection of every time he had been on the outside, every time he had been judged and found wanting without a single question being asked. He saw another soul seeking sanctuary. "There's a storm coming," he said, his voice flat, stating a fact. "You can't stay in here." She flinched, her eyes wide with panic, misinterpreting his words as an eviction notice. "Please," she whispered, the word cracking. "I won't cause no trouble. I'll be gone by morning. I swear it." Silas let out a slow breath, the sound of a man wrestling with his own better judgment. "I didn't say you had to leave the property. I said you can't stay in a henhouse." He gestured with his head toward the small, sturdy cabin that stood 50 yards away. "There's a cot in the main room, and stew on the stove. You look like you ain't eaten in a week." Ilera could only stare at him. Her mind, conditioned by a week of flight and terror, struggled to process the offer. She had been running from a world of cruelty and calculation, from her deceased husband's family who saw her and her unborn child as nothing more than an obstacle to an inheritance. Her brother-in-law, Beaumont, a man whose smile was as cold as a winter tombstone, had been the architect of her ruin. After her husband, Thomas, had died from a sudden, violent sickness, Beaumont had produced a forged letter, a false confession that painted her as an adulteress and a thief, framing her for stealing family jewelry. He had turned the local law against her, branded her a fugitive, all to ensure that Thomas's share of the family fortune, legally hers and her child's, would revert to him. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and a tiny, heart-shaped locket, her last tangible connection to the man she had loved. She had run until her feet were blistered and her hope was a dying ember. The henhouse had seemed like the end of the line. And now this man, this stranger, was offering her a cot and stew. It was an act of such simple, profound decency that it felt more unreal than the nightmare she was living. Suspicion warred with an exhaustion so deep it was a physical ache in her bones. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you help me?" Silas looked away from her, his gaze settling on the distant mountains, their peaks already beginning to blur with the approaching rain. He didn't have a simple answer. It was a feeling, a gut instinct, the same one that had kept him alive on the battlefield and on the long, hard road that followed. It was the recognition of a shared humanity in a world that often sought to strip it away. "Because the chickens don't need the company," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with the ghost of a smile. "And it's going to rain. Now, are you coming? Or do you aim to see if you can swim in the dust when the storm breaks?" He stood up and walked toward the cabin without looking back, leaving the choice entirely to her. For a long moment, Alara remained frozen, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a fragile, burgeoning hope. Then, with a groan of stiff muscles and a will summoned from the very dregs of her strength, she pushed herself to her feet. She took one last look at the squalid little shelter that had saved her, and then she stepped out into the fading light, following the quiet stranger toward the promise of a roof and a warm meal. It was a step into the unknown, but for the first time in days, it didn't feel like a step toward a cliff's edge. It felt like a step towards solid ground. The cabin was one room, spare and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bedroll neatly tucked in a corner, a sturdy table with 2 chairs in the center. The cot he'd mentioned was against the far wall, little more than a canvas sling on a wooden frame, but to Alara, it looked as inviting as a feather bed in a fine hotel. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the savory aroma of the stew simmering over the low fire. It was the smell of a home, a life. Silas ladled a generous portion of the stew into a bowl and placed it on the table. He added a thick slice of bread beside it. He did it all with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that seemed to be the very essence of the man. He didn't hover or watch her, instead turning his attention to securing the cabin for the storm, checking the latch on the door, and shuttering the single window. Alara ate like a starving animal, her initial shame overwhelmed by a ravenous hunger. The stew was thick with potatoes and carrots and savory chunks of rabbit, and it warmed her from the inside out, chasing away some of the deep, chilling fear. When she was done, she looked up to find Silas sitting at the other end of the table, nursing a cup of coffee, his eyes on the fire. "The agreement is this," he said, his voice calm and even, not looking at her. "You can stay. You can eat. The cot is yours. In return, you keep to yourself. You do what work you're able. Mending, tending the small garden out back when the weather clears. Nothing that'll strain you. I ask no questions about where you came from, and you ask none about me. When you're ready to leave, you leave. That's the bargain." It was more than she could have ever hoped for. A truce, a place to rest, to think, to simply be without having to look over her shoulder every second. "I thank you," she stammered, the words feeling inadequate. "I can work. I'm a hard worker." He gave a slight nod, accepting her words. "Get some rest. You look like you're about to fall over." The first test of their strange arrangement came 2 days later. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth dark and damp. Silas announced he was riding into redemption for supplies. The words sent a jolt of ice through Alara's veins. The town was where the danger was, where a lawman or worse, one of Beaumont's hired men might be. She watched him saddle his horse, a stoic, powerful buckskin, her anxiety a palpable thing. "You don't have to worry," he said, as if reading her mind. "No one comes out this far without a good reason. You'll be safe here." His confidence did little to soothe her, but she could only nod, retreating into the cabin as he rode away. The silence he left behind was immense, heavy. For the first hour, she did nothing, starting at every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind. The fear was a poison, and she knew if she let it, it would consume her. She had to fight it. She had to hold up her end of the bargain. Looking around the small cabin, her eyes landed on Silas's work shirt, draped over the back of a chair. There was a long tear in the sleeve, and a button was missing. It was a small thing, but it was something she could fix. Her mother had taught her to sew, to make do and mend, to find value in repairing what was broken. Finding his small mending kit in a wooden box by the hearth, she sat on the cot, the rough fabric of his shirt in her lap, and began to work. Her hands, clumsy at first from disuse and fear, slowly found their old rhythm. The needle dipped and rose, a tiny, silver fish swimming through coarse brown cotton. With each stitch, she felt a measure of her panic recede, replaced by a quiet focus. She was not just a fugitive. She was a woman with skills, with purpose. When she found a spare button in the kit that was a near-perfect match, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. In redemption, Silas navigated the familiar currents of suspicion. He tethered his horse outside the mercantile and felt the usual stares. He was used to it. He bought his flour, his salt, his coffee, the things he always bought. But this time, he also bought a small sack of beans and an extra side of bacon. Miller, the store owner, a man with watery eyes and an insatiable curiosity, noted the extra items. "Expecting company, Silas?" Miller asked, his tone attempting to be casual. "Winter's coming early," Silas replied, his voice flat, offering no purchase for further questions. He was about to leave when Sheriff Brody stepped into the store. Brody was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat, puffed up with his own importance, but lacking true substance. "Silas," Brody said, his eyes flicking over Silas's purchases. "Just the man I wanted to see. Had a rider come through yesterday. Bountyman, asking about a woman. A fugitive run off from down south. Said she might have headed up this way." Silas's posture didn't change. His face remained a placid mask. Inside, however, a switch had been flipped. He became intensely aware of every detail. The way the sheriff's gaze lingered on the bacon, the slight lean of Miller's body, eager to overhear. "That's so," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," said she was a thief. "And a looker," he said, "'cept she might be." In the family way, Brody's eyes narrowed slightly. "You ain't seen anyone like that out of your place, have you? Strange things happen out in the territories." This was the moment, the test. He could tell the truth, or a version of it. He could lie. A lie was a risk, a thread that could unravel. The truth was a betrayal. He chose a third path, indifference. He met the sheriff's gaze without blinking. "Sheriff, the only females I've seen on my land in the past year have 4 legs or feathers. If a looker in the family way shows up at my door, I'll be sure to let you know. Seems like she'd be hard to miss." He delivered the line with a touch of dry irony that made it sound both truthful and dismissive. Brody grunted, seemingly satisfied. The idea of a woman, especially a fugitive, seeking refuge with a reclusive black rancher seemed too far-fetched, even for town gossip. Silas paid Miller, gathered his things, and walked out of the store, his back straight, his pace unhurried. He didn't let himself exhale until he was a mile out of town, the dust of redemption behind him. The bounty man's presence changed things. Her anonymity was gone. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was here, sniffing at their heels. When he returned to the cabin, the sun was low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He walked in to find the room tidy, the fire stoked, and the smell of fresh bread in the air. Alara had found his small stash of yeast and flour and had baked. It was a gesture of gratitude, an offering. She sat at the table, looking nervous, expectant. He set the supplies down and saw his mended shirt, folded neatly on his bedroll. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of small, even stitches. The new button was sewn on so securely it looked like it had always been there. He looked from his shirt to her face. He saw her hope, her fear that she had overstepped. He picked up the shirt, feeling the repaired sleeve. He didn't thank her. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for the language they were beginning to build, a language of actions, of quiet offerings and unspoken trust. Instead, he simply took the warm loaf of bread from the table, broke off a piece, and ate it. He nodded once, a gesture of approval that was more eloquent than a dozen words of praise. In that moment, the cabin felt less like his space that she was occupying and more like a shared territory they were beginning to fortify together, stitch by stitch, loaf by loaf, against the coming storm. Days bled into weeks, and a fragile rhythm took hold. It was a life measured in sunrises and sunsets, in the small, necessary tasks of survival. Alara rose with the dawn, her initial fear of Silas softening into a cautious respect. She tended the small vegetable garden he had neglected, her fingers rediscovering their familiarity with the soil. She coaxed new life from the stubborn earth, her efforts rewarded with the green shoots of beans and squash. She learned the landscape of his silence, recognizing the different qualities of it. There was the easy quiet of shared work, the contemplative quiet of the evening by the fire, and the watchful quiet when he stood on the porch, his gaze scanning the horizon, a sentinel guarding their small, isolated world. Silas, in turn, found his solitude subtly altered. It was no longer an empty space, but one that was now occupied by a quiet, resilient presence. He would return from a day of mending fences or tracking a stray calf to find the cabin filled with the scent of her cooking, a simple meal of rabbit stew or roasted prairie chicken waiting on the table. He found his socks darned, his spare shirt washed and folded. These were not the actions of a servant paying a debt. They were the gestures of someone building a nest, making a home out of a temporary shelter. Her pregnancy, once a secret she tried to hide, became an undeniable fact. The gentle swell of her belly grew more pronounced, her movements becoming slower, more deliberate. Silas never mentioned it directly, but his awareness was clear in his actions. He began leaving a pail of fresh water just inside the cabin door each morning, so she wouldn't have to carry it from the well. He took over the heavier tasks in the garden without being asked, his hands, strong and calloused, pulling the most stubborn weeds. One evening, he returned from a long ride, not just with a brace of grouse, but with a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. He placed it on the mantelpiece without a word. Alara would look at it sometimes when he was out, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. It was a gift with no name, a thing of beauty in a life that had been stripped bare. Their conversations remained sparse, functional. "The beans are coming in," she would say. "Horse through a shoe," he would reply. Yet in the spaces between the words, a deeper understanding grew. They learned each other through observation. She saw the gentleness in the way he handled his horse, the patience with which he repaired a broken harness, the profound loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He saw the fierce strength beneath her fragile exterior, the stubborn set of her jaw when she fought a wave of morning sickness, the quiet dignity she maintained despite her tattered clothes and uncertain future. One afternoon, a tempestuous autumn storm rolled in from the plains with shocking speed. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf, ripping at the roof of the cabin. A sudden, violent gust tore the door of the henhouse from one of its leather hinges. The chickens, squawking in terror, began to scatter into the wind-whipped prairie. "Stay inside," Silas yelled at Alara over the roar of the wind, grabbing a coil of rope and a hammer as he ran out into the maelstrom. But Alara couldn't stay put. She watched from the doorway as he wrestled with the broken door, the wind threatening to tear it from his grasp. She saw a few frantic hens being driven toward the arroyo, where they would surely be lost or fall prey to coyotes. Without a second thought, she grabbed an old blanket and ran out to help, her skirts whipping around her legs. "Get back inside," he shouted again, his voice raw with frustration and concern. "They'll be lost," she yelled back, her voice thin against the gale. Together, they moved in a chaotic, desperate ballet against the elements. He fought to secure the door while she, using the blanket like a drover, managed to herd the terrified chickens back toward the relative safety of the damaged coop. The rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid, icy sheets, plastering her thin dress to her skin, blinding her. A sudden clap of thunder, so close it shook the ground, sent a wave of dizziness through her. She stumbled, her hand flying to her belly as a sharp, cramping pain shot through her lower back. Silas saw her falter. In an instant, he abandoned the door, letting it slam against the side of the coop. He was at her side in 3 long strides, his arm wrapping around her waist, supporting her. "I told you to stay inside," he said, but the anger was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He half-carried, half-drag her through the deluge, back to the warmth and safety of the cabin. He sat her in a chair by the fire, his hand surprisingly gentle as he wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. The cramping had eased, but she was trembling, soaked to the bone, and terrified. "The baby," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "Is the baby—" "Hush now," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He knelt before her, his gaze locked on her face. "Just breathe. Everything's going to be all right." He stayed there, a quiet, solid presence, until her trembling subsided and the color returned to her cheeks. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm had passed. The barriers of their carefully constructed arrangement had been washed away in the rain. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his charge. They were two people who had weathered a storm together, and in doing so, had found themselves irrevocably bound. The incident left a subtle but profound shift in its wake. The polite distance they had maintained was replaced by a quiet intimacy. There was a new tenderness in the way Silas looked at her, a protective watchfulness that had deepened into something more personal. He began to talk more, not about himself, but about the land, the animals, the turn of the seasons. He taught her how to read the clouds, how to distinguish the call of a hawk from that of an eagle. He told her the names of the wildflowers that grew in the foothills. One evening, as she was kneading dough for the next day's bread, a wave of nausea and pain washed over her, more intense than before. She gasped, leaning heavily against the table, her face pale. Silas was across the room, cleaning his rifle, but he saw the change in her instantly. He set the weapon aside and was at her side, his hand hovering near the small of her back, unsure of what to do. It's nothing," she said, trying to straighten up, but another wave hit her, forcing a small cry from her lips. Fear, stark and sharp, cut through his usual composure. "This ain't nothing," he made a decision. "There's a woman, Martha, an old midwife, lives 2 hours east near the creek. Her husband was a sawbones in the war. She knows things. I'm taking you to her." "No," Elara protested, panic in her voice. "We can't. What if someone sees us? What if that bounty man? I'll take the high trail through the rocks. No one ever uses it. It's a risk, Elara, but staying here and doing nothing is a bigger one. I won't let anything happen to you." "Or the child." He said her name for the first time, and the sound of it in his low, steady voice was both a comfort and a shock. He helped her onto the buckskin, his hands firm and steady at her waist, and mounted behind her, his body a solid shield against the cool night air. The ride was slow, agonizing. Silas navigated the treacherous, moonlit trail with an instinctual skill, the horse's hooves picking their way carefully over the loose rock. Elara leaned back against his chest, exhausted and scared, drawing strength from his solid warmth. The steady beat of his heart against her back was a calming rhythm, a reassurance in the vast, silent darkness. Martha was a woman whose face was a roadmap of a long and difficult life, but whose eyes were clear and kind. She took one look at Elara and ushered them into her small, cluttered cabin, which smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke. After a brief, gentle examination, she mixed a tea from a handful of dried leaves. "The babe's just settling low," she announced, her voice calm and reassuring. "It give a woman pain sometimes. This will ease it. You need a rest. No more chasing chickens in a thunderstorm. You hear?" she said, giving Elara a knowing look that suggested Silas had explained everything in a few terse sentences on her doorstep. As Elara sipped the bitter, soothing tea, Silas stood by the door, speaking in low tones with Martha's husband, a quiet man named Henry. Later, as they prepared to leave, Martha pressed a small cloth bundle into Alara's hands. "Things for the babe. Old but clean. And this," she added, giving her a small jar of herbal salve. "For the pains, if they come back." The ride home was different. The fear had subsided, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. The night was no longer menacing. The stars were a brilliant canopy overhead. Elara felt the tension ease out of her body, and she leaned her head back against Silas's shoulder, a gesture of complete and unconscious trust. He stiffened for a moment, surprised by the contact, then relaxed, his arms settling more securely around her. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was no longer empty, but full of unspoken emotion. He had not only protected her, he had cared for her. He had risked his own safety, his precious isolation, for her and her child. A few days later, the threat they had managed to keep at bay arrived on their doorstep. A rider appeared on the horizon, not the shambling figure of a prospector, but a man who sat tall in the saddle, riding a fine horse. He was heading directly for the ranch. Silas saw him first. "Get inside," he said to Alara, his voice low and urgent. "Go to the root cellar. Stay there. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Fear clawed at her throat, but she saw the hard, resolute set of his jaw and obeyed without question. She scrambled down the ladder into the small, dark space beneath the cabin floor, pulling the heavy wooden door down over her head, leaving only a tiny crack to see through. The rider was one of Beaumont's men, a hired gun named Fletcher with a cruel mouth and cold, assessing eyes. He reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the property. "Howdy," Fletcher called out, his voice laced with false bonhomie. "Looking for the owner." Silas emerged onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. "You found him." Fletcher's eyes flickered over Silas, a flicker of contempt in his gaze. "I'm looking for a woman. Passed through these parts. Pretty thing, dark hair, and carrying a child. I told the sheriff a week ago, I ain't seen anyone like that," Silas said, his voice level. "Yeah, I heard what you told the sheriff," Fletcher sneered. "But my boss, he pays me to be thorough. He seems to think a woman on the run might look for a place to hide where no one would think to look for her. A place like this," his gaze was insolent, deliberately provocative. "He's offering a handsome reward, enough to fix this place up right." "I'm not interested in a reward," Silas said, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. "And I'm not interested in company. You got a long ride back to wherever you came from. I suggest you start it." From the cellar, Alara watched, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Fletcher could hear it. She saw the man's hand drift toward the pistol on his hip. She saw the almost imperceptible shift in Silas's stance, his body coiling like spring. The air crackled with tension. Fletcher held his position for a long moment, a standoff of wills playing out in the dusty yard. He was weighing the odds, looking at the solitary black man and his small, isolated ranch. But there was something in Silas's eyes, a cold, hard certainty that gave him pause. This was not a man who would be easily intimidated. This was a man who knew how to handle that rifle, and who looked perfectly willing to use it. Finally, with a curse under his breath, Fletcher seemed to decide it wasn't worth the trouble. "Have it your way," he spat. "But if I find out you're lying, I'll be back. And I won't be so polite next time." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Alara didn't move until she heard Silas's footsteps on the floorboards above her and a soft tap on the cellar door. "He's gone." She emerged, trembling, into the light. He was standing by the table, his rifle now leaning against the wall. The confrontation had drained the color from his face, leaving it a taut mask of controlled fury. She looked at him, at this quiet, solitary man who had just placed himself between her and certain doom, who had faced down a hired gun for her sake. The secrets between them suddenly felt like a chasm. He deserved to know. He deserved to know who he was protecting and what enemy he had just made. "Silas," she began, her voice shaking. She reached inside her collar and pulled out the small, heart-shaped locket, the one thing she had left of her old life. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a tiny, painted portrait of a handsome, kind-faced young man. Her Thomas. His name was Thomas, she whispered, holding it out for him to see. "He was my husband." And then, the story she had held captive for so long finally broke free. She told him everything. She told him about the Chandler family, their wealth, their cold pride. She told him about Thomas, the gentle second son who had defied his family to marry her, a woman with no name and no fortune. She told him about Beaumont, the cruel, ambitious older brother who had always resented Thomas's happiness. She described Thomas's sudden, violent death, the disbelieving grief, and then Beaumont's swift, calculated betrayal. The forged letters, the accusations of theft, the way he had turned the whole town against her overnight. "He wants the inheritance," she finished, her voice raw with pain and anger. "Thomas's portion was meant for me, for our child. Beaumont couldn't stand it. He'd rather see me hang than see me have a single penny. He framed me, and he will hunt me until he finds me." She finally looked up at him, her eyes pleading, desperate for him to believe her. "I'm not a thief, Silas. I am not." Silas listened to the entire story without interruption. His face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the locket she held in her hand. He took in every detail of her frantic, whispered confession, the names, the places, the raw, undeniable ring of truth in her voice. He had seen liars in his time. Their stories were full of holes, their eyes shifty. Alara's story was a solid, terrible thing, told with the desperate clarity of the unjustly accused. The pieces fit. The bounty man, the expensive horse, the name Chandler, which he vaguely recognized as a powerful family from the South. When she was finished, an exhausted silence filled the cabin. She waited, her breath held, for his verdict. Would he believe her? Or would he see her now as a liability too great, a danger that would surely bring ruin down upon him? Would he finally tell her to leave? He didn't speak. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked over to a large, battered wooden trunk that sat at the foot of his bedroll. It was the one piece of his life that remained a mystery to her. He never opened it when she was around. He knelt before it and unlocked the heavy iron latch with a key he wore on a leather thong around his neck. The lid creaked open. Alara watched, her confusion mounting. He reached inside, past neatly folded clothes and a few worn books, and drew out a small, oilskin-wrapped package. He placed it on the table and carefully unwrapped it. Inside, nestled on a piece of dark velvet, was a star. It was not the cheap, tin star of a local sheriff. This one was silver, heavy and official, its 5 points polished to a dull gleam. In the center were the words, U.S. Marshal. He picked it up and held it in the palm of his hand. "My name is Silas Jones," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight she had never heard before. "And this is my authority." The blood drained from Alara's face. She stared at the star, then at his face, her mind reeling, unable to connect the man she knew, the quiet rancher, the gentle protector, with this symbol of implacable federal law. A marshal. He was the law, the very thing she had been running from. A wave of utter desolation washed over her. It was a trap. It had all been a trap. His kindness, the shelter, the shared meals. It was all a lie, a patient, cruel deception to win her confidence. She had walked right into the cage and locked the door herself. She had confessed everything to the one man who had the power to drag her back in chains. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief, a sob catching in her throat. She stumbled backward, away from him, away from the glinting star on the table. You tricked me. Alara, listen to me." He stood up slowly, his hands held out, palms open, in a gesture of peace. But she couldn't see it. All she could see was the badge. "You've been playing me this whole time," she accused, her voice rising with hysteria. "Waiting for me to confess. You're going to take me back to him. To Beaumont." The thought was so horrific it stole her breath. She would hang. And her baby. "No," Silas said, his voice firm, cutting through her panic. "Look at me. Look at my face. Am I the man who would do that to you?" She stared at him through her tears, her heart a warring mess of terror and the memory of his kindness. She saw the man who had given her water, who had mended her coop in a storm, who had held her hand on a dark trail. But she also saw the silver star. "I became a marshal for a reason," he continued, his voice low and intense. "And it wasn't to hunt down frightened women. It was because of men like Beaumont Chandler, men who have money and power and believe the law is something they can buy and sell to serve their own greed. I've spent my life watching men like that twist justice into a weapon against people who have nothing. I took this badge to untwist it. He took a step closer. She flinched, but didn't retreat. I work alone. I keep to myself. I live out here as a rancher because it lets me see things, hear things, without people getting suspicious. It lets me learn the truth of a place before I have to act. I didn't know who you were when I found you. I only knew you were in trouble. Everything that's happened since, it wasn't a trick. It was me getting to know you. He paused, his gaze unwavering. I believe you, Alara. I believe every word he said. Fletcher coming here, the way he acted, it only confirms it. Beaumont is a guilty man hiding behind a badge he bought. Her tears began to subside, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. Could it be true? Could this man, this agent of the law, actually be on her side? It seemed impossible, a fantasy born of desperation. What happens now? She whispered. Now, we have a choice, he said, his focus absolute. We can run. I can get you away from here, maybe up north, to a new territory where he'll never find you. You can change your name, start a new life. It would be hard, but you would be safe. He let that sink in before continuing. Or we can stay. We can fight. We can use this, he gestured to the star on the table, to see that real justice is done. We can expose Beaumont for the murderer and the thief that he is. We can clear your name, secure the inheritance that is rightfully yours and your child's. But we'll be dangerous. Beaumont will not give up easily. He will bring the full force of his influence against us. He was giving her the choice. He was putting her future and his entirely in her hands. She looked at the silver star, no longer seeing it as a symbol of her doom, but as a possible key to her freedom. To run would be to survive, but she would always be looking over her shoulder. Her child would be born to a fugitive, a life lived in the shadows, built on a lie. To stay, to fight, it was terrifying, but it was a fight for the truth, for her husband's memory, for her child's future, a future free of the stain of Beaumont's lies. She thought of the unborn life within her. She wanted her child to be born into a world where their mother's name was clean, where they could hold their head high. She straightened her shoulders, a spark of the Chandler fire she had married into, the fire Thomas had loved, igniting in her eyes. We stay, she said, her voice clear and steady. We fight. A slow smile touched Silas's lips. It transformed his face, erasing the years of weariness. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. All right then, he said. Let's get to work. He picked up the star and, for the first time, pinned it to his shirt. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place stood U.S. Marshal Silas Jones, and he had a case to solve. The plan was simple in its audacity. They would not hide. They would set a trap, using Beaumont's arrogance as the bait. Silas knew that men like Beaumont couldn't stand a loose end. The knowledge that Alara was alive and free, a potential threat to his inheritance, would eat at him. Fletcher's failure would only make him more determined to handle the matter himself. First, Silas rode to the nearest telegraph office, a full day's ride away in a larger town where he wasn't known. He sent a coded message to a single trusted contact within the Marshal service, Judge Amos Peterson in Cheyenne. The message was concise, investigating wrongful warrant against Alara Chandler in redemption. Suspect brother-in-law Beaumont Chandler of coercion, fraud, and possible murder. Situation volatile. Require federal injunction to supersede local authority pending my investigation. Proceeding with caution. Jones, he knew it was a risk. If the local telegraph operator was in Beaumont's pocket, it could tip their hand. But it was a necessary risk. He needed the backing of federal power to face down the local law that Beaumont had so thoroughly corrupted. While he was gone, Alara's role was one of quiet preparation. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. But her work was not in reinforcing the doors. It was in reinforcing the truth. At Silas's instruction, she wrote a long, detailed account of everything that had happened since Thomas's death. She wrote about Beaumont's veiled threats, his strange visits to Thomas in his final days, the look of triumph on his face at the reading of the will. She wrote down every detail she could remember, no matter how small. It was a painful, draining process, forcing her to relive the worst moments of her life. But as she wrote, she felt a shift inside her. The act of putting her story to paper transformed it from a chaotic, terrifying memory into a solid, factual testimony. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness. When Silas returned, he brought with him not just supplies, but information. He had spoken to the stable master in Redemption, a talkative old man who remembered Beaumont Chandler's first visit. He'd recalled how Chandler had spent a great deal of time and money in the saloon with Sheriff Brody in the days leading up to the warrant being issued. It was circumstantial, but it was a start. It painted a picture of bribery and corruption. "He'll come," Silas said, reading her written statement with a grim nod of approval. "He won't be able to resist the chance to shut you up for good. And he'll bring the sheriff with him to make it look legal." "And what will we do?" she asked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "We let him walk into the parlor," Silas said, tapping the silver star on his chest. "And I'll be the spider." They didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, 2 riders crested the hill. It was just as Silas had predicted. Beaumont Chandler, impeccably dressed even after a long ride, sat on a magnificent black stallion, the very picture of wealth and authority. Beside him, looking uncomfortable and out of his depth, was Sheriff Brody. Inside, Elara, Silas commanded softly, "Stay by the hearth, where they can see you. Don't speak unless I ask you to. And no matter what happens, trust me." She nodded, her heart hammering, and took her place in the chair by the fireplace. She held her head high, her hands resting on her belly. She would not let Beaumont see her fear. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his stance relaxed, his marshal's badge gleaming in the morning sun. He didn't have his rifle. The display of the badge alone was a statement. Beaumont reined in his horse, his eyes, cold and gray like river stones, fixing first on the badge, then on Elara, visible through the open cabin door. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a dismissive sneer. "A marshal," Beaumont said, his voice dripping with condescension. He dismounted with an air of supreme confidence. "And a black one at that. The government is getting desperate for men, it seems. Sheriff, it appears we found our fugitive." And her new protector, Sheriff Brody, shifted in his saddle, his gaze darting nervously between Silas's badge and Beaumont's arrogant smirk. "Now, Marshal," Brody began, "I have a legal warrant for this woman's arrest. For theft." "I've seen your warrant, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice calm and even, cutting him off. "And I'm telling you it's not worth the paper it's printed on. It was obtained under fraudulent pretenses. This is now a federal matter." Beaumont laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A federal matter? On what grounds?" "This is a local dispute. This woman is a common thief who fled justice. I am merely a concerned citizen helping the local law." He took a step toward the porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of the ornate pistol at his hip. "Now stand aside. We're here to take her." "You'll do no such thing," Silas said, his voice hardening. He didn't move, but his presence seemed to grow, to fill the entire porch. "You're not a concerned citizen, Mr. Chandler. You're a murder suspect." The words hung in the air, electric and deadly. Brody's jaw dropped. Beaumont's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A dark flush rose up his neck. "That is a slanderous accusation," he snarled. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Silas replied, his eyes like chips of flint. "Let's talk about proof. Let's talk about the large sums of money you paid to Sheriff Brody here in the days before he issued that warrant. Let's talk about the stable master who remembers how you too were thick as thieves. That's proof of bribery and corruption." Brody went pale, stammering, That's a lie." Silas ignored him, his focus entirely on Beaumont. "And let's talk about your brother, Thomas. A healthy young man who dies a sudden, violent death just weeks after his new wife becomes pregnant with his heir. An heir who would inherit the fortune you felt was rightfully yours. My brother's death was a tragedy." Beaumont spat, his voice tight with rage. "Was it?" Silas countered, taking a deliberate step forward. "Or was it an opportunity? You produced a letter, a confession from his wife. A forgery, we now know. But you, Mr. Chandler, you made a mistake. A small one, but a fatal one. Elara, tell me about the locket." From her chair, Elara's voice, though trembling, was clear. "My husband gave it to me on our wedding day. It has his likeness inside. And you never took it off?" Silas asked, his gaze still locked on Beaumont. "Never," she said. "And yet," Silas said, turning his full attention back to the furious man before him, "the letter you forged, Mr. Chandler, the one supposedly written by Alara, confessed to stealing family jewelry. And it specifically mentioned a heart-shaped locket with a master's likeness inside. How could she confess to stealing something that was never missing? How would you know to put that detail in the letter unless you had seen her wear it, and, in your greed, assumed it was part of the family jewels you were trying to reclaim?" Beaumont was trapped, his face contorted with rage and panic. He had been so sure of his own cleverness, so contemptuous of everyone else, that he had overplayed his hand. That one tiny, greedy detail was his undoing. "This is ridiculous. A fantasy," he roared, but his eyes darted around like a cornered rat. He saw his power evaporating under the cold, steady gaze of the Marshal. He saw the dawning comprehension and fear on Sheriff Brody's face. He was losing. In a final, desperate act of violence, his hand shot to his pistol. But Silas was faster. He had been waiting for it, expecting it. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He wasn't aiming to draw. He lunged forward, not for his own weapon, but for Beaumont's. His left hand clamped down on Beaumont's wrist like a vice, squeezing until the bones ground together. His right hand delivered a single, brutal blow to Beaumont's jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed in the still air. Beaumont crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the dust. Silas stood over him, breathing heavily, the fire of battle in his eyes. He looked at Sheriff Brody, who was frozen in his saddle, his face the color of ash. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice deadly calm, "you have a choice to make. You can be a witness for the federal government against this man for murder, bribery, and corruption, or you can be his co-defendant. I suggest you choose wisely." Brody scrambled from his horse, his hands raised in surrender. "Witness," he croaked. "I'll be a witness. I'll tell you everything." Silas nodded, his gaze softening as he turned to look at Alara. She was on her feet, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears of relief streaming down her face. He had done it. He had faced down a monster and won. The dust began to settle in the yard, both literally and figuratively. The immediate, violent threat was over, neutralized, and lying in a heap at Silas's feet. Sheriff Brody, a man thoroughly broken of his purchased arrogance, was hastily binding the unconscious Beaumont Chandler's wrists with a length of rope from his own saddle. The air, which moments before had crackled with mortal tension, was now filled with a profound, ringing silence. Silas walked back onto the porch, his movements slow, the adrenaline of the confrontation visibly draining from him, leaving behind a deep weariness. He stopped in front of Alara. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the last vestiges of the stoic lawman fell away. He was just Silas again, and she was no longer a fugitive or a case file. She was Alara. Her tears were not of fear or sorrow now, but of a relief so immense it was overwhelming. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another, until she was standing directly before him. Without a word, she raised a trembling hand and gently touched the silver star pin to his shirt. Her fingers traced its 5 points, the symbol that at first terrified her, and then, impossibly, had become her salvation. "Thank you," she whispered, the words encompassing everything: the water in the henhouse, the shelter from the storm, the protection from the gunmen, and this, the reclamation of her life and her name. Silas's hand came up and gently covered hers, his warm, calloused fingers closing over her own on the star. "You were the one who was brave enough to fight," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I just cleared the path." Their eyes met and held. In that long, silent gaze, everything was said. A bond forged in shared hardship and mutual respect, which had quietly blossomed into something deeper, was now sealed in the quiet aftermath of their victory. The ghosts of their pasts, her unjust persecution, his lonely isolation, seemed to recede, burned away by the bright, clear light of the present moment. Sheriff Brody, having secured his prisoner, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Marshal, I'll be taking him back to town. I'll hold him in the cells until your federal people arrive." He looked genuinely chastened, a man who had stared into the abyss of his own corruption and been granted a second chance. Silas simply nodded, not taking his eyes off Alara. He watched Brody heave the groaning Beaumont onto his horse, tie him to the saddle horn, and begin the slow, ignominious ride back to redemption. The dust kicked up by their departure drifted on the breeze and settled. Peace descended upon the small ranch. The chickens, unbothered by the human drama, were clucking contentedly in their mended coop. The wind whispered through the tall grass. It was the same landscape as before, but everything felt different. The cabin behind them was no longer a hideout or a temporary shelter. It was home. Silas gently took Alara's hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. He led her away from the porch, away from the spot of the confrontation, and back toward the open cabin door. As they stepped across the threshold, from the harsh sunlight into the cool, gentle dimness of the room they now shared, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but full of a newfound certainty. "Everything is going to be all right now, Alara." She looked up at him, her face illuminated by the light from the door, a soft smile gracing her lips. For the first time in a very long time, she believed it. She squeezed his hand, a silent answer that spoke of new beginnings, of a future not of running, but of building. And as he closed the door, shutting out the last of the world's dangers, they were left in the quiet, hopeful sanctuary they had built together. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.